Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to the Forces from Beyond seasonal edition of Tournament Tactician. Now, if you've watched these before, you'll notice one thing that's missing right off the bat, and that is the matchup charts for every deck on the tier list into the tier 1 decks. Part of the reason for that, there's only one tier 1 deck this time around, and it's Kai'Sa Demacia. And I'll go ahead and spoil the matchup charts for you now. They're really bad for everybody into Kai'Sa. The only deck that is performing well into Kai'Sa, by which I mean 55% or better, on ladder with a substantial play rate, or sort of back and forth of games between them, usually looking for something over 100 times that the matchup has been played, is Pirates. And it's not even all the aggro decks. It's not Pirates and Spiders and Anti-Jin. It's just Pirates. So triple aggro, not looking particularly juicy for this seasonal, but Pirates definitely in a well-slotted position, and arguably could have been tier 1. The problem sort of being with it that Scouts has been having a lot of tournament success lately as well. You cannot run the Misfortune in both of them. I do not think Pirates is as good if you drop that Misfortune for Gangplank so that you can run it alongside Scouts, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The reason that Kai'Sa is standing so far above everything else, part of it is the strength of the deck. Another part of it is the flexibility, because you can really put Kai'Sa in any lineup, and it just kind of makes sense because everybody really has to ban it. The only lineup I can conceive that would want to leave Kai'Sa open and feel like they can consistently do well over the course of a 9-round tournament is going to be like Kai'Sa Demacia plus Ezreal Cannon plus Pirates. And I know that Ezreal Cannon is like supposed to be this big Kai'Sa counter. The ladder stats do not reflect that, but I take the word of the players that have been playing the Ezreal Cannon to success in telling me that, you know, it does beat the Kai'Sa deck, even if the stats don't necessarily support it. It's a very important thing to figure out is what your personal stats look like. But it's really just a Kai'Sa show. And last season, even though it was very much a Winding Light show, I was still able to tell, okay, these are the decks that are going to be next in line. You know, your Thralls, your Bard whatever, your Twisted Fate Nami. This time around, not so much. We've seen everything succeed on the patch, and it's only been a week. And we all kind of knew out of the gate the Control was going to do very well, and it did. But very, very quickly, within 2 days of the patch, we had already had a Control win in a tournament, an aggro win in a tournament, a mid-range win in a tournament, and we just haven't seen anything usurp the other archetypes as the very clear best deck or best lineup. And part of that is just that because Kai'Sa can go in anything, it can also not go in anything. So when I'm looking at tournaments from this patch, it's very hard to tell if players that didn't bring Kai'Sa didn't bring it because they think it is targetable, and they just haven't figured out how to do it, or they're scared of targeting it, but they don't want to be the one getting targeted. So they're like, okay, you know, obviously this is the best deck in the game. Everybody's going to be gunning for it. It's safer for me to just not bring it. Or if they are so solid in the fact that they are running Kai'Sa in their seasonal lineup that in these smaller events, they've been experimenting with the other decks that they want to use to round out the lineup. And every time I see Kai'Sa absent from a winning lineup, it's hard to tell which one of those it is. But for the most part, it looks like picking on Kai'Sa is not a realistic avenue to victory. And I don't even know how popular it's going to be because it hasn't shown insane top cut popularity through even just the releases of Forces from Beyond, not even just necessarily patch 3.13. The most Kai'Sa decks I've ever seen in the top 8 is 5, which is pretty on par for whatever the best deck in the game is at the time. The problem on this patch, as opposed to last patch, is that nothing is even coming close to matching the Kai'Sa. When we look at a top 8 and we see 4 Kai'Sa, you know, last patch there was also going to be like 4 Bard Alawi, and then like 3 of another deck, and then a couple 2-ofs before we disperse into a bunch of 1-ofs. Now it's, you know, 4 to 5 Kai'Sa, then we jump all the way back down to like 2-ofs, and then a bunch of 1-ofs. So we are just seeing everything that isn't Kai'Sa succeed in an equal capacity, which is not great for figuring out what the meta is going to look like. Or maybe it actually gives you a good idea of what the meta looks like because it's going to be a little bit of everything. There's no perfect lineup. You should just bring your most comfortable decks or what you perceive as the most powerful decks because you are probably just going to run into a little bit of everything. And there's no lineup that on its own is statistically going to beat a little bit of everything. And that also means a little bit of Kai'Sa and a little bit of non-Kai'Sa. So when we're tiering things out for this seasonal, what I'm trying to give you is a picture of the most powerful decks within that archetype just so you have an idea of if you needed confirmation on like, yeah, like is my Jaceheimer Darkness Kai'Sa lineup from day one still fine? The answer is yes, it's still fine, but nothing's really feeling better than fine. If you wanted to just run the 3 most powerful decks in the game, which is usually what I recommend, I don't have a very clear number 3. I think that Kai'Sa and Pirates is your starting point. I think that Scouts are on a comparable power level to Pirates, but of course you can only play one of them. And I think that's why so many people are going for this Poppy Tarek Scouts X lineup, the X nowadays sort of being rounded up by Kai'Sa Demacia. I know Sergey won the Mastering Runeterra event with Nasus Thresh, Poppy Tarek, and Scouts. But since then, we have had another tournament won by Poppy Tarek Scouts and Kai'Sa Demacia. So the problem with Pirates is that they are a little bit targetable, but their targets are weird. I was going through the matchup charts for Pirates specifically, trying to figure out what are the 3 decks that are going to absolutely hose Pirates. The answer was Field Rush, Echo Zillion, and Scouts. Now, I don't love that Scouts is on that list if I was looking to be a Pirate player. So what if you decide to bring Scouts instead? Well, Scouts are losing to Kai'Sa, Evelyn Viego, and Jace Heimerdinger. And I think that Jace Heimerdinger is one of those decks that was very looked at when the patch came out. It was obviously a very clear winner of the patch, as well as being one of the best decks from the previous season. So I think that Jaceheimer probably going to be a top 3 deck in terms of play rate. I think players find this to be a very safe deck. And then if we're looking at what Jaceheimer loses to, because yeah, Boulevard dug a little bit into this, Jaceheimer is losing to Pirates, FTR, and Monkeys. So even if we just wanted to look at like what are the best decks that I can be running, we have this triangle now of Jaceheimer, Scouts, and Pirates. And I think that is going to have a lot more impact on the meta than Kai'Sa specifically. I think a lot of players are just going to be on the ban Kai'Sa train, and then we're kind of in this Jaceheimer, Scouts, Pirates triangle. And it's really weird to have singular deck triangles in a 3-deck format when, again, there's like this other deck in Kai'Sa that sort of like demands the ban. So that's where things get really scrappy. And yeah, maybe I could have put Jaceheimer, Scouts, and Pirates in tier 1 as well, because those are the things that are going to be kind of the most powerful decks, the ones that you would expect to see the most of if you had to predict something. The problem is that, like, Jaceheimer has really not been seen since the opening 2 days of the patch. When we're watching players perform well with Control E lineups, Jaceheimer is starting to get excluded for things like Darkness, Viego Shurima, TF Nami, Ezreal Kennen, as these 2 decks, while listed as combo here, do play like control decks for the most part. And that's not even, we haven't even gotten into tier 3 yet, where all of these decks are just as viable as the tier 2 decks, maybe a step below them in power level, or maybe kind of wishy-washy on the matchup charts. Feel the Rush is an example of something where apparently it is beating Jaceheimer and it is beating Pirates, which should position it as one of the best decks in the game, and yet we are just not seeing it brought to tournaments. So I can't tell if this is a actual upset to the triangle and FTR should be extremely popular and everybody should be running it, or if the stats are just a little bit wrong, because the stats do that sometimes. That's my consensus of tier 2. These are the powerful decks for the archetype. I think everything in tier 3 is just as viable, especially if you're comfortable with it. But if we're just talking raw power level, I think these decks are a step above these decks. So getting into tier 3, we're going to sort of breeze over some of these decks, the Bartolawi, the Draven Scion, the Frostbite Midrange, Zigstalia Deep, all that kind of stuff. And right down to Viego Evelyn, which is the final hour Dark Horse. Now, leading into this seasonal, a lot of historical trends are lining up, right? Scouts has had a big resurgence. Squallywag got top 4 at a Mastering Runeterra tournament with a lineup that no one else brought. We're starting to get used to these things. And one of them that has been happening for the last couple of seasonals is this deck that starts to appear the week of the seasonal. And so far, the 2 that stand out the most clearly to me, when I started to recognize this pattern, was the Curious Journey seasonal, where then it was this Tristana, Ionia, Fae deck. Just kind of popped up at the last minute. A couple of players brought it to a fair amount of success. Last season, I would argue that it was Bartolawi, where it was a known factor for a lot of the season, but it was more of a joke deck. You know, it couldn't really compare with Bard Poppy and Bard Ari. And then as we got to the week of the seasonal, it really started to ramp up as, you know, a very strong deck in a lot of people's minds. Viego Evelyn is that deck this season. And I wouldn't let your entire seasonal ride or die on the final hour Dark Horse. You know, this deck does have a good Scouts matchup, apparently, which I wouldn't have expected from looking at it. But it is what it is. The problem with it is that when you look at the matchup charts, which is all you really can go off of for these decks that don't have a lot of time in the sun, is that it's really only got a good Scouts matchup going for it. So if that is the kind of deck that you decide you want to soft target, so to speak, like you want to go Jaceheimer, Viego, Evelyn, and Kai'Sa, like that's fine. And I think that's where Kai'Sa is really interesting for lineup composition, is you can kind of use it as a crutch, right? Where all of a sudden you don't really have to think about bringing Kai'Sa. You can just kind of do it. It's a relatively straightforward deck to play. I assume that most of you have touched it at some point. You're at least a little bit comfortable on it. And it's just this thing that you can expect to eat a free ban most of the day. I wouldn't really worry about getting soft targeted on it. And it lets you then focus on this triangle of Scouts, Pirates, Jaceheimer, and really just kind of find a second deck that fits into that wheel for you, and then just round the whole thing out with Kai'Sa. Call it a day, right? If you want to be not necessarily even brain dead about it, it feels like one of those things where it's like, if you want to not think, bringing Kai'Sa is a great idea. And then you climb that hill, and it's like, okay, well, actually, no, I shouldn't bring Kai'Sa because this, and this. And then when you get to, like, you know, the expert level again, it's like, okay, yeah, I should just bring Kai'Sa. It's one of those kind of curves. I think you know the meme that I'm talking about. But because of that, there's really not much more analysis to give. It really is just kind of, there's so many questions, and we knew this was going to happen when we only had a week to prepare for the seasonal. And even when the patch dropped, I sort of had this idea of like, okay, obviously like control is the level 1, it's the very obvious good thing. Yeah, we're going to start the level 2 that in terms of like, these are the things that beat control, then we level 3 it, and the things that beat that. And the question is just, where do we end up on the day that the seasonal actually happens? Which is why I'm a little bit worried that this is coming to you on Wednesday. The seasonal is not until Saturday. There is time for a drastic meta shift between the time this comes out and the time the seasonal happens. But I don't think it's going to be too outside the wheelhouse of Kai'Sa sitting on top and then your dogfight of Jaceheimer, Pirates, and Scouts. That's kind of where everything feels like it should be. And then there's some dark horses thrown in there, like Feel the Rush apparently beating Pirates and Jaceheimer. This Evelyn deck that is really the only Evelyn deck we've ever gotten to look at, and all of a sudden, you know, it's coming in and it's beating Scouts. And I don't want to just like ignore the rest of the tier list, but like Poppy Tarek is, it seems like a lot of people are just kind of homogenizing their lineups. Like, you're not just going to run Darkness. You're going to run Darkness with another control deck. You're going to run Poppy Tarek with another rally deck. You're going to run Spiders with another aggro deck. So I think that people are really pigeonholing their lineups archetypally, and usually it'll be like Kai'Sa and 2 things that share an archetype, or at the very least 2 of the decks are going to share an archetype, right? And then maybe your third deck on paper doesn't, like Sergey's lineup where it's like, okay, I brought 2 rally decks and Thresh Nasus. Yeah, Thresh Nasus isn't a rally deck, but it does play similarly to the rally decks and just like building up this board state. But instead of rallying, I drop a Nasus on you. That's kind of the difference, right? You can look outside the box a little bit and see the homogenization, the shared overlap of strategy here. And again, as such, since you're going to see a little bit of everything, you just got to bring the comfort on it. Personally, I'm a control player. I would be on the control side of things here. I would be bringing Kai'Sa Demacia. I'd probably be bringing Jace Heimerdinger. And then, yeah, that's kind of where the questions start to come in, right? Is what do I feel like is that good third deck? And I've played a lot of Darkness in my time. I've lost to a lot of Scouts while playing Darkness in my time, so I'm not super eager to hop on that train. But, you know, then the Poppy Tarek is left over for me to try to beat it with Darkness. And, like, these are just the kinds of things that you're going to think about where when we talk about what the popular lineups are going to be, I can't give you 3 deck lineups. I can give you 2 deck lineups. And then the question is, are they running Kai'Sa or are they running another deck that fits within their archetype? Like, when we look at control, it's going to be a lot of Jaceheimer and Darkness. When we look at the rally decks, it's going to be a lot of Poppy Tarek and Scouts. Aggro, Pirates, and Spiders, although aggro is a little bit more likely to go triple aggro, though I think if you are going to run into aggro Kai'Sa, it's more likely to be Pirates and Spiders than having an Annie Jin anywhere in there. Combo's not really a lineup, but like these are sort of filler decks to round out the rest of a lineup. You know what I mean? Like, no one's running TF Nami as Kennen and Kaisa Demacia and being like, yeah, this is my lineup, man. No, it's really, as Kennen has a specific place in the meta, but I think a lot of players really want to run this deck. And some seasonals are going to live and die based off who decided they had the balls to bring Ezreal Kennen and who didn't. So if you're watching this and you're on the fence about the Ezreal Kennen and you're like, yeah, you know, this Pirates as Kennen Kaisa Demacia like lineup sounds really fine on paper, but I don't know if I can consistently beat Kaisa the whole time, or like if Ez Kennen's going to falter out on these other matchups, just run it. Just run it. Because I haven't played, I think I've played one seasonal, but I only did it for the card back I dropped. But the point is, I've looked at seasonals before and I've decided, okay, you know, what lineup would I have brought? Did anybody top with that lineup so I at least know that like it was possible? And for the first like 3 or 4 seasonals, I kind of decided that whether or not I had topped that seasonal had I played probably would have come down to whether or not I had the balls to run Star Spring. And I decided that in most cases I probably wouldn't have. I probably would have dropped Star Spring and I would have run other things. Kennen Ezreal is that for you right now. Kennen Ezreal is your Star Spring. I'm telling you to nut up and run it. Just run it. So I was going through and editing the video, and I noticed that I didn't really leave you with a takeaway, at least not a concise one, so that's what I wanted to come in and chime in real quick. Because you're going to be seeing a little bit of everything, this is a very ladder-reflective seasonal, right? Ladder is the environment where you go and you see a little bit of everything, and the ladder win rates are kind of reflective of what is your deck, how often does your deck win against a little bit of everything. So I think that this is actually the season where you should be looking at ladder for inspiration most strongly. And when we think about the best ladder players of all time, someone that's going to pop to mind is JO1. And this is some weird advice, right? But JO1 plays an absurd amount of 1-ofs because JO1 puts the tools in his deck to win against a little bit of everything. Now, whether or not the draws line up on that specific instance is up to fates, but if you want to succeed, you might have to take that JO1 approach. You might have to just be prepared for a little bit of everything and hope that you can draw things in the correct order. You should probably be running Radiant Guardian in your Kaisa Demacia if Pirates is the deck that you're losing to. Oh, what about Noxian Fervor? Run a 1-of single combat. Run a 1-of, I don't even know what other anti-aggro Shurima and Demacia cards I can think of off the top of my head, but that's kind of the takeaway I wanted to give you here, is because we are in a very open environment, we are much more closely resembling the ladder than we traditionally do in tournaments, and I think that these big gaps that we sometimes get between the ladder meta and the tournament meta, not as big this time around. So that is really gonna do it for me. I know this wasn't as in-depth, maybe not even as helpful, but there's not a lot of help to be had. We have a very good idea of what the meta looks like, whereas opposed to last time, we had no idea, right? It was, okay, there's this, and then there's all these other things. Now we have a very good idea. The problem is that the pool is just like 12 decks that you could see outside of Kaisa. So remember to test. Remember to trust your instincts above all else. Even if you lose by them, if you stick to your guts enough times, you'll end up topping, winning even. But yeah, that is going to do it for me, I guess. Thank you so much for watching. As always, good luck in your seasonal tournament.